How y'all doing? I'm the Watchman, and this is part three. Is it part three? Part three of Ruth. Part three of Ruth. And I haven't thought of the subtitle name yet, but we're gonna pick up right where we left off. Right where we left off. And right where we left off was Naomi and Ruth had just returned to town. She had just returned to town, and Naomi was letting the people know how bitter and hurting she was. How bitter and hurting she was. And we left off at the beginning of chapter 2. So that's where we're going to start off. At Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. Ruth chapter 2, verse 1. And it reads, And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth of the family of Elimelech. And his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field, and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. And she went, and came, and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap, which means good fortune or luck, and her good fortune, her hap, was too light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. And that means she wasn't really having any luck. She really wasn't having any luck. It was real light. Her luck was real light. But anyway, her hap, let's read that again, was too light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Who was of the kindred of Elimelech. Now, before I get into what we just read, because that's what we're going to cover in this part. Before I get into it, I want y'all to know that the law of God in Israel at this time gave the poor. This is very important to go with the story. The law of God gave the poor a right to a certain portion of the produce of the soil. When hungry, a man was at liberty to go to his neighbor's field or orchard or vineyard and eat of the grain or the fruit to satisfy his hunger until he got full. So knowing that, that's why Ruth says in verse 2, she just says, Let me now go to the field, and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. Let's get right into it, because there's a lot of meat. There's a lot of meat and food in this part that we just read. First off, the first thing that stuck out to me was Ruth was willing to work. She was willing to work. And I think we need to keep the story in mind that here Naomi was old. Naomi was old, and Ruth, her loyalty, her heart, her character was so strong and tight knit with the Lord. And I have this pause and stop. You know, sometimes we as Christians can learn a lesson from some non-Christians. You know, sometimes there are a lot of non-Christians whose character is more aligned with God than our own. Just some food for thought. Because that's what I see with Ruth right here. Her loyalty and her love is so strong that when she said, I will go with you, Naomi, you know, she knew she would have to carry the burden. But what did Ruth see in Naomi's God? Before I believe, let's get to it. Let's keep going. So we see that Ruth was willing to work. She was not lazy at all. And I like to call your attention to everything I read in the Word. The majority of the people that God used, have y'all noticed that He found them working? God does not use lazy people. Let me clarify. If you have a hard time doing stuff on your own, around the house, going to work, period. If going to work to you is just a burden, like, no, I ain't saying like, cause a lot of times I be like, I don't really want to go in here and do these 8 hours. I'm not saying like that. If you are that lazy to where you are inches away from not working just because you rather sit at home on your butt, on your keister, and do nothing, God does not use people like that. Now, He can use you if you change. But if you can't go out and earn a paycheck to sustain your living, do you think you're really going to make an effort to go out and spread the gospel? And that's outside of work. The majority of people who are spreading the gospel are people who go to work and then still go and spread the gospel. So God really chooses those hard workers and people who don't mind expending themselves for a goal or for a mission. People who aren't lazy at all, who do whatever it takes to finish a goal, or just basically people who aren't lazy. Let me just say it like that. Basically, people who aren't lazy. And that hit me with the story of Elisha. In the story of Elisha, when it says when Elijah came upon Elisha and he was plowing in the field and he threw his cloak on him, and all of a sudden it hit me like, God chooses those who are always working. Look at Gideon. He talked to Gideon when Gideon was in the threshing floor, with the grain and the wheat. He called Simon Peter and his brothers when they were out fishing. God loves hard workers because He knows if you are a hard worker on your own personal time and you like to stay busy, then you will definitely carry that trait over into the word and into spreading the gospel and into spreading the gospel. So the first thing I want to point out, that Ruth, we can see right here, Ruth was a hard worker. Naomi didn't have to tell her to go on out. Ruth suggested, hey, I'm about to go on out here and try to get us some meal, get us some food for the day. Ruth was a hard worker. And another thing that we see right here in verse 2 is she sought counsel first. Even though she's the one that's going to be carrying the burden, and she actually sought the advice and counsel first. How many of us make moves without seeking counsel from God first? Sometimes we'll seek counsel after our move done went wrong. Then we'll seek counsel. But how many, and this is something I had to work on myself, y'all. How many of us seek counsel from God first before we do anything? Before we do anything or say anything. And just to lay the backdrop for this short part, we're going to read Boaz, who hasn't entered the story yet. We just know him by name now. Boaz is a symbol of God in this little part that we're reading right here. And Naomi is a symbol of Jesus in this little part. And Ruth is a symbol of one of God's servants, or one of Jesus' servants. One of Jesus' servants. But anyway, let's get back. Before we get to that, I'm about to get into that in more detail. But anyway, she sought counsel first. And you see from Naomi, so we can say that's Christ. She sought counsel first from Jesus to find out what she should do, what she should actually do, what she should do. And as we see, she says in verse 2, she says, let me now go to the field and glean ears of corn after him in whose sight I shall find grace. She was willing to just fall in line. Now, this is so very important when you look at verse 1. It says, and Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth. Majority of the time, that's like saying he was a millionaire. Let's say Boaz was a millionaire. The Lord just don't say he was wealthy. He says a mighty man of wealth. So we could say he was a billionaire. He was sitting on a lot of money. She doesn't say, let me go and ask Boaz for money, or let me go and beg for it, or for some money. He's wealthy. Look what just happened to us. I lost my husband. You lost your husband and both your sons. He's your kins. He's gonna give. She doesn't go into none of that. How many of us would have did that? She doesn't go into none of that. She was willing to just receive Boaz's grace if he imparted it to her. Look at verse 2. She says, "Let me now go to the field, glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace." She was willing to go and just work first. She had the willingness to work first. And then she was going not to beg for grace, not to demand grace, not to ask for it, but just ready to receive it. Now remember, I said in this little part right here, Ruth, we're picturing Ruth as us. Ruth is the servant. How many of us are, first off, how many of us are just willing to work without a blessing promised to us? How many of us need a blessing to go out and do God's work, or need a blessing promised to us to go out and do God's work? That's even a trap. And I ask this question. I'm telling you, y'all. A lot of the questions I ask are questions that I ask myself first. And I have to ask myself when I do certain things, am I expecting a blessing from doing this? Because if I'm only doing this to expect a blessing, then I shouldn't be doing it at all. It's sad because I see a lot of Christians who only work and do God's will, what they perceive as God's will, only with a blessing in mind. How many of us are willing to work without a blessing being actually received to us at that moment? How many are you willing to work without a blessing being given to you right then, or some acknowledgement right then? That's deep. She was willing to go work without having grace first. And I look at myself like that. How many of us are willing to just go work without having received grace yet? Without having received grace first. And she didn't go. Now I'm taking this into the analogy of us as God's servants. And also, she didn't go the same way she didn't go demanding from Boaz. It's the same way we shouldn't just go demanding from God. Even though God says, prove me. In Malachi, he says, prove me now. Test me, try me. But should we? He says, but should we go demanding? You don't have to demand. You don't have to, you can prove God without demanding something. You see what I'm saying? You can, that's where faith comes in. You can have so much faith to where you know that God is going to keep his word. So you go ahead and act. You shouldn't just, Lord, you said, and now you can come to Father and say, God, you said, it's in your word. Now he says do that. And you can say, Lord, you said it. I've done it before. Lord, I'm your child. You said you're going to take care of your children. But does God need reminding of the things that he says? Does he? Or should you just act and say, if I receive grace, as she did when she says, after him in whose sight I shall find grace. And that just leads to what I'm about to say right now. Do you see she says, after him in whose sight I shall find grace. She knew she was going to find grace in Boaz. See, the 10 years or so, we know Naomi had been in Moab for 10 years, but we don't actually know how long Ruth had been with her. But in this time, she had been introduced to God through Naomi. And I believe Ruth had faith in God. And she was showing it right here, because she didn't say, maybe I'll find faith. She said, I'm going to work and I shall find grace. I shall find grace in Boaz. Now remember I said Boaz is a symbol of God and Ruth is a symbol of us as servants. And so how many of us know, are we just go work, just do the will of God, do what God will have you to do, and know that you will find grace. We say grace was freely given to us all. We just have to receive it in faith. We have to receive it in faith. So I love that part, how she says, I shall find grace. And she isn't even an Israel, y'all. She isn't even an Israelite. And she's saying, I shall find grace. We should say that and know that. We should know that. And when you're getting down, when you're feeling down and the devil's in your ear, I'm telling you, when you keep that saying right there in your mind, when you keep that I'm out here, I'm doing God's work. First he's saying, I'm going to go out and do the work, and I know I shall find grace. So know in your heart, beloved, that when you're out and you're just doing the will of God, when you're doing his work, when you're serving him, because the word serve in Hebrew means avode, which means to work. So when you're serving God, know in your heart that you will find grace. Too many times we work and we serve God with I might find grace attitude, or God might bless me, or I hope he sees what I'm doing. I hope he sees what I'm doing. No, she doesn't have that. She says, I'm going to go out in the field, I'm going to work, and I will find grace in Boaz. Whew, that's deep, y'all. That's deep. That's deep. As we look at the spiritual significance of these short little verses, I want to stress that Ruth represents a faithful and loyal servant. Like I said, and Naomi is a representative of Christ, and Boaz is a symbol representative of God. Now look at it. Naomi and Boaz was kinfolk. They were family, just like God and Jesus are family. Ruth is a Gentile. We're all Gentiles. Unless you're a true blood Jew, we're all Gentiles. Just as Ruth was a Gentile, we're all Gentiles coming from idolatrous nations. As Ruth is a Moabite, coming from idolatrous nations. And only through Naomi can she claim kinsman to Boaz. Only through Christ can we claim kinsman. Can we claim to be kinsmen of God? Ooh, are y'all seeing the symbolism here? In the same way, look what Naomi tells Ruth at the end of verse 2. She says, go, my daughter. The same way that Naomi sends Ruth to the field is the same way that Jesus sends us out to the mission field. He tells us to go gather the wheat. But he say the harvest is plenty, but the laborers are few. And that's so deep. It's so deep that the same way Naomi sends Ruth to the field, the same way Jesus sends us out to the mission field. And look what field Ruth goes into. Now this stuck me right here. Is Ruth humbly falls in line. Let's go back up to verse 2 where she says, and glean ears of corn after him. Now she knew Boaz was a mighty man of wealth, like we established. So do you think that she knew that Boaz would be physically out there doing it himself? No. She knew Boaz had servants. So she was willing, when I say fall in line, she was willing to play her role. Let me expound on it even more. God has his servants. the angels, the prophets who give us this, his messengers. Are we willing to fall in line and go after them? Or do we sometimes want to go our own way? Do we sometimes want to do our own thing? Use our own opinions? You know, some Christians have problems with that falling in line. You know, there's many angles to look at this because some Christians, you know, different pieces of a human body are needed to make the whole body. You know, the fingers can't do what the eyes can do. The eyes can't do what the nose can do. The nose can't do what the mouth can do. You feel me? So there's people in your church, in our churches. There's people in the church who want to be the eyes. They want to be, look, I pointed to my mouth when I said eyes. Wow, Josh. But there's people in the church who want to be the eyes, who want to be the mouth, the eyes, the nose, the nostril, the ear. They even want to be a bad hairline. They want to be everything. You can't tell them that they can't be everything. They get mad at you. They get mad at you. You know, how come I can't be the hairline? Like, cause you're a nose. A nose can't be a hairline. You know, so but that's how some people are in the church. You have to know your role. You have to know your position. What things you're with, what gifts you're blessed with, what gifts you're not. Because if not, you just gonna make an ugly hairline. You know, and that's crazy. You're just gonna make an ugly hairline. Now, while y'all watching the rest of this, please don't just sit staring at my hairline. I don't mind. I don't care. Anyway, I'm just joking. But anyway, the seriousness of it is that Ruth was humbly willing to just fall in line. Fall in line behind the servants of Boaz. How many of us are willing to just fall in line behind the servants of God and just play our part, play our role? You know, we don't have to go in there and you know, and jump right in with the servants. Let the angels and the Holy Spirit break up the ground. Let you know. Now let's think about reaping now. Boaz's servants are going through and they're chopping. She's willing to do. There was a benefit to go behind. You know, it has its ups and downs, but there was a benefit to go behind. You know, that a lot of the cutting she didn't have to do. They've already done it. You know, she wasn't gonna gather much. She wasn't gonna gather much, but she didn't have to do a lot of the work. Think about it. Think about it, and this plays a big significance in the next part that we're gonna do. But anyway, before I forget, she's willing to play her role. She's willing to fall in line, as we as servants should be willing to fall in line the word and come after. Sometimes the word after, to come after, means to follow, and we should be willing to follow God's servants for what they say, not for what we believe in our personal thoughts and beliefs. I've had to throw certain personal beliefs out the door when I saw that it contradicted this, you know, and I had to just fall in line. And that was hard for me. I was very stubborn and hard-headed when I had to just fall in line. Fall in line. And another thing about reason why, you know, when I look at, let's look at the field as the mission field. There's so many significance to this, is that say God's servants have already been through a certain neighborhood. The people in the church, oh, we've been to that neighborhood, we've handed out tracts, we've knocked on doors, you know, there's really no one left there, you know, how many of us are willing to go pick up the scraps? To go again, we'll say, well, you might have missed somebody. Let me go back and knock on a couple more doors still. Well, we didn't have too much luck in that part of the town, or, you know, I wouldn't call that person. I've called that person before, you know, you know, and they really wasn't too interested. How many of us are willing to go behind and give them one more call? Well, let me call them one more time. Let me call them one more time to see. You know, there's so many benefits, and there's so many Christians who aren't willing to go behind. go behind. They just want to go where it's all plentiful. Where it just looks and appears plentiful. Even though they might not be willing to do all the hard work, but that's all they want to. Nobody's willing to go where it doesn't look like there's nothing. It looks like you really ain't gonna get too many. Not even one convert or not even a conversation. Not too many people are willing to do that. And like I stated before, the uh the poor the poor people of Israel only got to go to a certain portion of their neighbor's field or a man's field. So she had to go and that's why it says that her hat in verse 3 says her hat was too light on a part of the field belonging unto boys. She was on the part of the field where the poor people could go and reap after his reapers, after his servants. So I want you to see the significance of this. She was willing to go and reap amongst the poor. And I know a lot of Christians who only like to go to good neighborhoods. My sister and my brother-in-law, my sister Jennifer and my brother-in-law JC, cool cat. Uh, got a lot of respect for JC. Takes good care of my sister. But they were, their church one Sabbath said, we're going to feed the poor and hand out food to the homeless. Who wants to come? And, they're like, yeah, let's go. Doing that, let's go. She said, my sister and my brother said they looked, and they were in suburbia, the rich neighborhoods. How many poor did they expect to reach? What's so sad is that this is common. You saying you're going to feed the homeless? Go to where the homeless are at. There are certain things that keep people from going down there. Fear. And then people's spirit. They have a haughty spirit. They're, well, I really don't want to be seen. And, those people are dirty, nasty. I could catch something if I shake their hand. All kinds of stuff keep Christians from going to where the need is. But here, Ruth, she's gleaning with the poor. And I want to say that again. I want to bring light to that again. And that's in the 3rd verse. And that's why it says, and her good fortune was too light. Her luck was too light on a part of the field belonging. That's why it says on a part of the field. She had to pick where the poor people, where the people who had nothing could pick, where Boaz allowed them to pick. She had to pick, and that's why, as you'll see in the later verses, if you go on and read ahead of me, which I stress, go ahead and read ahead of me, you'll see that Boaz told her, go ahead and follow my maidens. He's giving her permission to, you can go, hit the field up. You can go, you can get off just this one section that I have sectioned off for the poor. But she was willing, and it showed where her spirit, her broken spirit, and then again, that shows justification. How her, and like I said before in part 2, how I'm going to show how her and Naomi went through justification, sanctification, which leads to glorification. And this is a sign of justification, is a poor spirit, a broken spirit, as the title of part 2, that she's willing to go reap amongst the poor because she's poor herself. The reason why a lot of Christians don't go to where there's the real need, to where there's the poor and the lacking, is because they feel like they're above that. They don't see that they're poor and lacking themselves. So they don't see the great need in going to those. They think that, I'm going to tell you, to be honest, I love y'all, and I'm always be honest with y'all. Some Christians don't go to the poor neighborhoods and the poor blocks because they don't want them people coming into their church. I'm being real honest with you. I've seen it. And they didn't know I seen, but I've seen it, to where they want to skip over those neighborhoods because they're afraid that those people might come to church and it might make their church look bad, which is sad. Which is sad, you know. Man, they're actually afraid that because they know God's word will touch. Like Caiaphas, and when they decided to kill Jesus, I believe it's in John, right after Jesus brought Lazarus back from the grave, in the same chapter, and it says, Caiaphas said, if we let him alone, everyone will believe on him. We have to get rid of him. That's the same way with these Christians. They're like, no, I don't want to really go to these neighborhoods, because if I start speaking of Jesus, even though I'm not speaking it with power, because I really don't want to see them converted, Jesus' name naturally brings power and brings conversion, whether they're speaking it with power or conversion or not. And that's what they're afraid of, and that's what they don't want. That's what some Christians, or not all, but that's what some don't want. So they skip over those neighborhoods because they really don't want that class of people, those people who are poor in spirit, to come to the church, when really, in all honesty, those are the people who are closer to God, because they see their I'm not going, and that's not in every case that the poor are closer to God. That's definitely not in every case. Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is, because I've been homeless and I've been there, and your reality of life is that you're like Ruth. Your reality of life is that I need God. You're not sitting all the time like, ooh, look what I'm blessed with. I'm good. I am good. No. Your reality is that I need help. And that's why God says, go to the fatherless, go to the widows, go to the poor, go to the prison house. And that is why Ruth was in that part of the field. But like I say, as her being a servant, then what I see in these first 3 verses of chapter 2, I see a faithful servant. A faithful servant. Somebody who's willing to work without expecting a blessing off top, but somebody who willing to work and know that as long as she's doing God's work, she will find grace. No need to go ask for and demand it when you already know that you will find it. No need to send the same prayer up to God 30 times like He didn't hear you the 5th time asking for stuff. And I'm being honest. Ask for it once. And if you're doing God's will, if you know in your heart that you're honestly doing God's work wholeheartedly, then say thank you. I'm telling you, God, we serve a great God, y'all. Say thank you. Thank Him. Even before it comes, thank Him. Just how like great Ruth in verse 2, before she knew she would find grace before she even went to the field. She said, I shall find grace. Keep that in your minds, beloved. Keep that in your minds, and it'll help you fight. It'll help you fight against our enemy when he thinks that you've fallen too far from God, or that what you're doing for the Lord is in vain. No, just know in your heart you shall find grace. Take care.